I stand before you as an academic, but also as the father of a 6-year-old who has a genetic neuromuscular disease called spinal muscular atrophy. So today's talk's going to be a little bit about academic research on disability in childhood and how that intersects with traffic injury and traffic injury prevention. But I'm also going to share with you some of our lived experiences of navigating the city with my daughter, because I think it really brings into focus some of what's being talked about in the literature. Where are we here? So, questions and concerns. So my initial review of the literature indicates greater focus on acquired disability. So our first speaker was talking about the injury costs associated with motor vehicle collision and the acquired disability component. But more specifically, when we're talking about acquired disability or developmental disability, our conversation really in much of the so-called developed world has come to focus on what's happening within the aging population. Much less attention has been given to disability in childhood. So I asked the question, what about lifetime congenital developmental disability, or whatever you want to call it? Disability is also absent or poorly articulated, I would argue, within many of the injury and active transport policy documents and programs that I've looked at. For example, I'm having a fascinating conversation right now with one of our regional planning organizations about how disability fits into the definition of active transportation. And it certainly does. And then what about the disabling effects of infrastructure and/or disabling infrastructure? So there's kind of a play on words there. It's not just about the ways in which infrastructure can produce risk, but it's also considering the ways in which infrastructure or infrastructures can contribute to disability, right? So that sort of thinking requires that you also conceptualize disability as being something that's not entirely located within the body. That there's some environmental and social component that's producing or making disability slightly more difficult. The TDSB, so when I talk about programs and policies that struggle with disability, years ago, the TDSB came up with a Charter for Active, Safe, and Sustainable Transportation, which is amazing. It's wonderful. They should be applauded for this. But then I started looking a little more closely at the imagery that was being used to project the program. So when I look at the children along the bottom there, it's unclear to me whether or not disability is part of the conversation or if this is just an unintentional sort of exclusion. When I look at Vision Zero, Toronto's latest road safety plan, we see a slightly different picture, right? So we see someone in a wheelchair, manual wheelchair, somebody I think possibly with a walker, but this is a 60-page document, and disability is discussed once under accessibility improvements, which is better than nothing, but there's more to be said there, and it's entirely unclear to me how disability is actually conceptualized within the context of this plan. So when I went into the literature, these folks did a wonderful job at digging into looking at pre-existing disability as an injury, as a determinant of injury, right? So not considering that, you know, a car has hit someone and there's an acquired disability that results from that incident, but rather considering the possibility that disability itself produces a set of conditions that put someone at greater risk of injury. And their conclusion was people with disabilities experience a higher risk to sustain an injury in comparison to the healthy population. So I put healthy population in red as well, because that's a contentious label to attach to the idea of disability. For example, my daughter is very healthy right now in the context of her course, in the context of her disease, and sometimes she's less healthy. And the sort of disability and CRIP community would take exception with that language. However, the article is still incredibly useful. There's a high need for large epidemiological studies of injury among persons with disability to better address these unique risk profiles. Just a really sort of cursory, quick glance into the literature, I found really very few studies that were actually looking at traffic injury risk with disability being treated as a determinant. There's also some interesting simulation work being done as well. So that paper at the bottom, the virtual street crossing piece, they recruited people who had MS and had them working through virtual environments. But I would draw your attention to the top piece, risk of vehicle pedestrian and vehicle bicyclist collisions among children with disabilities. This is a piece done in the US. That piece, in that piece they concluded that disabled pedestrians aged 5 to 17 were found to be 5 times more likely to be involved in a collision compared to those without a disability. That's an enormous problem. In terms of the relative risk. So the other thing that I would draw your attention to in this text that I've drawn out is that they refer to disabled pedestrians. So my daughter uses a wheelchair, but she goes for walks. I mean, so this also raises for me as an academic questions about, like, what is a pedestrian? How do we define that? How do we conceptualize this idea of a pedestrian? What if you're a pedestrian who uses technology to move within the city, just as she does? And what does the sort of language of the city, the infrastructure of the city, communicate to you about whether or not you belong in that space or not? So a couple of examples. This is Asha, and we were actually on a little trip in the Junction neighborhood, and this is a 300-pound electric wheelchair. It costs $27,000. We get some assistance through the Assistive Devices Program from the province of Ontario, but it's been a steep learning curve for everybody, I can tell you. Why do I bring up this picture? Well, this is we were on our way to an orthopedic appointment, and I just realized that in this particular moment, I'd captured my daughter scaled relative to all kinds of infrastructure. And one of the pieces here is the pedestrian signal button, which incidentally, she can't reach and she can't push because her disease limits her strength, right? I just was sitting there and I wrote down a list of things that I was freaking out about as we were trying to get across this intersection. I was incredibly stressed out by that environment because she was trying to navigate it with her chair. So there was we have curb cutouts. So the slope was a problem, the road condition was a problem, the traffic was a challenge, and she was sort of navigating around potholes and other stuff. The noise made it slightly difficult for she and I to communicate in navigating the intersection, and the signal itself. I mean, what is the purpose of this signal in this context? It doesn't work at all. Unless she has someone with her all of the time, but should that be a requirement? Thankfully, our friend Dylan Reed at Spacing has written a tutorial on all of these pedestrian buttons and what they do, what they're used for. But I would also note what Andrew just mentioned about the use of the smartphone technology and to scan a signal at a crosswalk in Singapore. I mean, even the buttons that are used to open a handicapped door, right? That button requires assumes a certain amount of strength, right? We have more technology in our phones than we have at our intersections, right? There's no reason why in the age of touchscreen technology that we should be relying on stuff like this. I mean, there are reasons why it happens, but there's no conceptual or technical limitation. This is another one in terms of, I've got about 45 seconds left here, and I've got to skip over my story about street parking, but I can share that with you at some time if you're interested. So a few Christmases ago, the elevator at Jane Station was broken, but we didn't know that. So my wife was coming back from the Santa Claus parade, and she called me. She said the lift is broken at Jane Station. So, okay, I go over there, and I have to negotiate my way into the platform so I can get down the stairs. And we lifted Asha up the stairs, not in the 300-pound chair. That would have been pretty impressive. But we have another push chair that we use. But the point is that we almost lost our balance at the top, right? Now, you could say, well, you could have gone back to another station, but we're talking about like, 2 or 3 stations away to the next accessible spot that might have a functioning elevator, right? And why should we have to do that? So that's an infrastructure problem, it's a political problem, it's a fiscal problem. It's like a problem that's happening on various levels involving numerous stakeholders. And it's a family problem. So what should we do? Well, I would argue that it's part of this is we have a problem of unimaginative and poorly informed design and engineering. And I think we look at sort of the disabled community population and we think about limitations. We should also be thinking about possibilities. I'm actually stealing this from my friend Tanya Tchaikovsky, who's a critical disability studies scholar at OISE. Thinking our way through some of the challenges that my daughter and other people face can produce solutions that benefit all of us. And that's sort of where sort of the principles of universal design come from. But it's a very real thing. This is not an abstract thing. This is a real conversation about the implications of this stuff for everyday life with disability and childhood. And of course, we have the Accessibility for Ontarians Disabilities Act, which by the time it gets to the road or the building, the recommendations, guidelines, et cetera, are sometimes heavily contested, watered down, so the final product doesn't necessarily meet the needs of the communities it was intended to help in the first place. So thank you for your time.